नमस्कार, मी गौरी कुबेर.
माझं नाव सुधीर इंगळगी.
मी अमित धर्म, रंजन मेढेकर.
माझं नाव रोहित कोकणे.
माझं नाव शिल्पा इनामदार यज्ञोपवीत.
मी ओंकार भस्मारे.
मी सुजाता साळवी.
माझं नाव नचिकेत शिरे.
माझं नाव बिल्वा गावकर.
आजचं समिट वॉज रिअली वंडरफुल. मराठी पॉडकास्ट समिट मी पहिल्यांदा असं काही अटेंड करतोय.
इथे अनेक पॉडकास्टर्सच्या ओळखी झाल्या. ही समिट खरंच खूप इन्साइटफुल होती. कॉन्व्हर्सेशन्सच्या बाबतीत असेल किंवा स्क्रिप्टिंग कसं करायला पाहिजे,
एडिटिंग, स्क्रिप्टिंग, मार्केटिंग आणि विविध प्रकारचे पैलू त्यांनी क्लिअर केले आणि मला वाटतं ते आमच्यासारख्या पॉडकास्टर्सना खूप माहिती देणारं होतं.
सकाळ या मराठमोळ्या या कंपनीनी हा प्लॅटफॉर्म आज इथे सगळ्यांना दिला की जिथे ट्रेड सिक्रेट्स एकमेकाच्या शेअर झाल्या. सकाळनं आयोजित केलेल्या या समिटमुळं खूप छान माहिती मला मिळाली आणि पुढचा प्रवास माझा सोपा झाला.
मला वाटतं मराठी पॉडकास्टरसाठी हे पहिलं अशा टाईपचं सेशन असेल.
इतकं नॉलेज शेअर झालं आणि कोर पॉडकास्टिंग काय असतं ते समजलं. सो इट वॉज व्हेरी हेल्पफुल.
यामा सगळ्या मराठी पॉडकास्टरसाठी हे खास संमेलन आज त्यांनी दिवसभराचं ऑर्गनाईज केलेलं, अतिशय योग्यरित्या आणि खूप नवीन इन्साईट्स, मग ते टेक्नॉलॉजीचे असू देत किंवा कंटेंटशी रिलेटेड असू देत, हे खूप छान आयडिया एक्सचेंज आज दिवसभरात झालं.
आणि ज्या पद्धतीने आजचं समिट झालं आहे सकाळ मीडियातर्फे आणि आयडिया ब्रूजतर्फे, सो फॅन्टॅस्टिक आयडियाज एक्सचेंज झाले आणि व्हॅल्यूज पण एक्सचेंज झाले.
आय विश देम ऑल द बेस्ट. थँक्यू सो मच सकाळ मीडिया आणि आयडिया ब्रूज.
थँक्स अ लॉट टू आयडिया ब्रूज अँड सकाळ ग्रुप.
थँक्यू सो मच फॉर सकाळ ऑर्गनायझिंग फॉर दिस समिट.
थँक्यू सो मच.
थँक्यू सो मच फॉर ऑर्गनायझिंग दिस.
आणि त्यासाठी आयडिया ब्रूज आणि सकाळ डिजिटल यांचं मी आभार मानते.
Let me know. All right. So that's a big number. We have, as of December 2022, 464 million listeners globally. And it is predicted that by the end of 2024, this number will grow above 500 million. So there is a huge demand for audio, especially for podcasts that we see globally. And that's why and I will go into detail about this later. All the big platforms, all the big brands like Apple, Spotify, Amazon are now focusing on becoming a powerhouse in the podcast production space. Today we have 5 million podcast listeners globally, and we have 5 million podcasts globally. And in between those 5 million, there's 70 million episodes. So the content creation is so high. And as you know, outside of India, the US is still domineering the podcast space because Apple launched podcasts, the podcast app, of course, exclusively, I think 15 or 17 years ago in the US. And there are 100 million active listeners in the US alone. And that will also grow beyond that in the next years. I know this is not for India, but outside of India, Apple Podcasts is the major platform for people to tune in and listen to their favorite podcasts. In India, it's Ghana, I believe. Is it correct, Swapnil, pronunciation, Ghana?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And why is Apple Podcast the leader in podcast streaming? It's very simple. It's because the most used phone in the world is an iOS device, an iPhone. I know in India it's not the iOS, it's actually an Android. So of course they're domineering the market. But compared to Spotify has the largest podcast library in the world. So there are actually more podcasts available on Spotify podcasts than on Apple Podcasts. Would you know what these numbers mean, these timings? Could someone tell me what you think this stands for?
Is that the time of the day when these podcasts are heard the most?
Bang on, yes. So globally, between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., this is when people tune into their podcast the most. And the time that you see below, the 8:15 to 8:30 a.m., is the peak time. And as you all know, most of us, when we get ready for work or ready for school, or we sit in our car or in the train or whatsoever on your way to work, that's usually the time when we take out our phone and listen to the podcast, and that is still dominated by the podcasts that are presenting news. But this is globally. And since I've worked on our Sakal Daily podcast, I can tell you that was also for us the peak timings in the beginning. And that's why when we created our first podcast on news in Marathi, we focused on the audience that in the morning, according to, in Pune especially, or in Maharashtra, people start a little bit later their work. But we adjusted it, and we saw that people would also tune in the morning the most, because that's the time when they get ready at home. And as you know, podcast is a very personal thing. Hardly anyone listens on podcast on speakers, but there again, we see a big trend with the home speakers. But nevertheless, people use to listen to podcasts, in the bathroom or on the headphones on the way to work. And so that's why it's still the peak time for people to listen to podcasts too. Any idea about this number?
Anybody? Completion rate of the episodes?
No, it's actually interesting. I ask a different question. Who of you listens to podcasts while doing something else simultaneously at the same time?
Most of
Almost everyone, right? Yeah.
Is this
but
driving
this
the
is
time consumption?
No, it's actually the number. It's the number percentage of people who are listening to a podcast, but also do something else at the same time. So cleaning the house or driving the car or even at work, and they listen to a podcast, or maybe, in the gym. So this is the number that also helps you when you create a podcast to understand the psyche of your audience, which I think is super interesting. I'm an avid listener myself, and there are one or two podcasts that I listen to where I only listen to the podcast because it's an educational podcast for me, right? Where I learn. So I know if I listen to the Huberman Lab, which is a podcast by the leading scientist at Stanford for neuroscience, I only try to listen to him because he gives me so much information that I actually take notes. But that is a very small number. If you see 60% of the people listen to a podcast while doing something else, right? Like cleaning the house, as I said, or running. And it's a form of entertainment. It's not, as I said, something that you do to learn, educate yourself, because then you would have to focus 100%. Right. What we also see is that the majority of podcasts are between 20 and 40 minutes long. That's a majority. But I'm excluding news formats, so news podcasts, because usually there we see the sweet spot between 8 to 12 minutes, especially for a morning brief. But nevertheless, globally, a minimum of 20 minutes, that's a podcast on an average. And what's also interesting that only 15% of podcasts are below 10 minutes. So again, that supports what I said, that most of the news podcasts are around 10 minutes long. These are the morning briefs. Other than that, you will see that podcasts are usually quite long. So this is an interesting chart. I pulled it out. It's on India. And it shows you how long people spend listening to a podcast. It's still a really big number, the green field. So around 70% say they don't use podcasts, which is good for you because you see there's such a huge potential for growth for people still to discover podcasts. But what we see is that both the blue ones on the right side are kind of the same percentage. And we see that people usually per week listen for 1 hour. So this is the category where people who listen to just a morning brief would fall into. So let's say 5 to 10 minutes, 5 days would come to an hour. But then we also see people actually listening 1 to 5 hours a week. And compared to the US, this green field with the 70% is actually 100. So the penetration of podcast listeners is so high. You can say almost every American, at least once in their life, have listened to a podcast and doing it frequently. And also 6 to 10 hours is what is 75% of people that listen to a podcast weekly. So it's really a new form of entertainment, and that's why the big brands are so hungry to get a piece of the pie, because podcast and audio entertainment is part of the future. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting one. It was updated a year ago, so I can't tell you what it was on December 2022, but it's quite solid research here. Yeah, so for years, Joe Rogan has held a position as the #1 podcast in the world. He has an exclusive partnership with Spotify. Most of you know they paid him 100 million to only get him to use his platform. So you see, the business is massive. And I feel in India, especially because we have such a huge population in India, the growth and the hunger for the international brands to get really good podcasters on their platform is going to be big. So they're going to be willing to spend money on you to sign you up. And since Maharashtra has 122 million people living there, the Marathi space is something that is also going to be focused on by the global brands a lot. So also interestingly, the Daily, which is from the New York Times, it is a news format. It is the most downloaded one, which is interesting. You can't download the John Rogan experience, but you can download the episodes of the Daily. And it is a news podcast, and people are still interested in news, and that's very promising. And you can tell if you do quality journalism that people even are willing to download the episode and listen to it at a later stage. This is a list of the global top 5 podcasts on Spotify. Again, it's Joe Rogan Experience. And there's true crime. There's a podcast called Call Her Daddy, The Daily by the New York Times, and Armchair Experts. And what I think is very interesting to understand is the pattern. You always, with those really good podcasts, of course, content is king, but also the person behind it. So what we see is that you should not change the host of the show too often. And you as the voice of the podcast and the mind behind the podcast, you become the brand. You're the reason why people listen to you. And we see it with all of these podcasts here. They have solid hosts who moderate the podcast without giving up their job, meaning that they will not change it. It becomes about the person. So besides that aspect, I will go also into the categories that are growing, but I think it's very important for you to understand you are the brand. You are as vital to the success of your podcast, you as a person. And so when you do the brand building, you really need to focus on who you are. Do you have a bio, do you have a write-up on yourself out? Do you explain why you have created this podcast? So as you know, in social media, it's all about the narrative, and all these people have done it beautifully, right? So this is interesting. This is the latest categories that are dominating the podcast world globally. So this is as of December 2022, so very recent. What we see is comedy, true crime, social and culture, and everything around self-optimization. So how do I become a fitter person? How do I become a healthier version of myself? And business. Business, motivation, entrepreneurial are the most popular categories. And if I look into, I'm just open it up on here. 2 years ago, it was different. During the pandemic, comedy was the same. That makes sense, right? Because during the pandemic, people were kind of depressed, stuck at home, so they wanted to laugh and have fun. So comedy was the number one category. Social and culture was the second most popular category. Health and fitness was quite big because it makes sense. We were all stuck at home. We were putting weight on, so people were tuning into health and fitness, to stay fit even though in lockdown. But what was also interesting which is not on this list, arts and entertainment and education. And what we saw during the pandemic, that people wanted to learn, take the time while they were at home and educate themselves. So that's why there was such a huge demand for educational podcasts. Now, if you fast forward, today business is a driving podcast category. And that is very interesting because today people actually started business getting out of Corona, out of the pandemic, being motivated. So why am I telling you this is to understand you need to be connected not only with your community, but what is happening in the world. Because if you launch a new podcast or you have to adjust the strategy of your podcast, you need to understand what's happening in the world. What are people searching for? What are the answers that your listeners or potential listeners are looking for? And what we see here is that, yes, true crime is growing immensely, but also business and self-optimization. People want to become the best self. And I also compared it to the Indian market, and I found it very remarkable is that spiritual content is huge, right? Spiritual podcasts are really big. Educational and business motivational podcasts are also dominating. So what I can tell from just understanding the charts in India is that people are always keen to educate and grow themselves, and also to because of the culture, the spiritual culture, to also educate themselves spirituality. So it's so this is what I'm seeing is a little bit different to the worldwide podcast trends. Yes. I would like to now go into what's happening in 2023 and 2024. So what we see is now, if you own one podcast, right? Many of the platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they want you to create more content. That means ideally they would want you to own a channel. What does that mean? It means that you have a channel, and under the channel you have several podcasts, and they want you to do that because they depend on you to drive their platform, right? And so it's very interesting what's happening both from Apple Podcasts and Spotify as a business. They are treating podcasts as the next big thing. They're looking at podcasts as something like Instagram, a Facebook, a TikTok, where you can make massive amounts of money for them. So they have changed the entire strategy to help you as a individual creator to really become a business. So they want you to come up with a podcast and make a business out of it, and they will help you on that way. And for example, Apple has launched a consulting arm where they actually, if you sign up on Apple Podcasts, they will give you the experts. They will give you free virtual sessions to help you become a podcast business. They have launched, this was just recently, they just launched diverse subscription strategies. So they know and they will predict that as with content online, that podcast has to go behind a paywall. People are willing to pay for the content if it's good. So they have created a platform where you can easily say, okay, I'm going to give early access to my listeners, or I want to give them an ad-free experience. So they really let you come up with your own strategy for launching a podcast. And they will give you an entire marketing tool set and also a dashboard to understand your audience. And why is it so important to understand this? Because they really believe that the next 7 years until 2030, the most money will be made with two segments. It's gaming, online gaming, and podcasts. So that's why and Apple is investing so much into their podcast platform, Spotify. I know Realigns is doing the same thing in Ghana. They all want you to use their platform because they see so much money can be made. The future is subscription. We have seen this in the entire digital space, not just as a news company, but we've seen it on social media. If you go on Instagram, you can now put your content behind a paywall and have your followers pay for the content. The same thing is happening in podcast. So what they're saying is basically the following. A lot of podcasters are scared to put their channel or their podcast behind a paywall. But what Apple and Spotify is saying, if you already have a good following and you put it behind a paywall, after 4 weeks, so this is based on 2-year study, after 4 weeks, your audience is going to grow more. So that's very interesting. So instead of thinking, oh my God, people will then stop, following me, that's not the case. What they're seeing, what Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts is seeing, that if once you have put your podcast behind a paywall, after around 4 weeks, you will see a higher engagement. Also, what makes sense, it's logical. If you have many shows, or you have one show that really draws a good audience, these are the ones that you should put behind a paywall. It's quite logical, but some creators are scared to do it because they don't want to lose out, right? And then what they also were saying is, if you go for subscription, the early access and exclusive access are the best performing benefits for the subscribers. So they really help you understand which are the best strategies to follow in order to grow. What is also very important for all the big podcasts is that you need to reinvent yourself over and over again, meaning you need to give good content to your listeners on a continuous basis. And this will also help you sign up more subscribers. What we see, for example, is some of the top subscriber shows, like the Joe Rogan Experience, give you early access to a show. Or they say every Thursday, all the subscribers will be the first one to get access to it. Or there is a bonus show, there's a bonus interview that you will get access to. So you need to really treat your podcast like an OTT platform or any kind of business where you give your listeners who pay for your service a bonus. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing will happen. What we also can tell is that the best performing podcasts, because earning money through, I'm not talking about subscription, but earning money through a podcast, through advertising, is very hard. We know that as Sakal, because to convey and convince brands to advertise with us, because it's an unknown sector for them to advertise on podcasts. But what we see is many of the best performing podcasts are actually recording the podcast and put it on YouTube. Because as you know, YouTube, you can earn a lot of money if you have a big audience there. So that is also one thing I would really recommend all of you to do if you have a solid following, is to always record your videos, your podcasts in a video format, and also put it on YouTube to get more revenue in. Because we see that the advertising market in podcast is growing, but it's growing right now only in the US and Europe, and Southeast Asia is still a little bit hesitant. Brands are still a little bit hesitant. This will change over the next 5 years, but for now, you have to have other strategies to create money, and that's why video is always a good thing to make money, especially when you put it on YouTube. Yes, that's basically from me. Didn't want to talk too long.
Thanks so much, Steffi. Pleasure hearing from you after a very long time.
Oh, hi.
Hello. So, thanks so much. Does anyone have any questions for Steffi? Okay, here we go.
Hi, Steffi Shrikant here. I'm an independent audio creator and a very lazy podcaster. Uh, the last slide that you showed, where you had sourced some data from Apple and Spotify, their recent acquisition of Gimlet kind of went the other way around. Any idea what happened there? Because they bought Gimlet and all of the Gimlet properties, but they put them behind a paywall and didn't necessarily see an increase in the entire audience and subscription metrics.
Yeah, okay, that's a little bit controversial from me because I've
I
seen that.
said you're free to not answer this. Absolutely.
It's just it's very controversial. I can't give you insights why this happened, but anyone who's in business development knows when these kind of companies are being acquired, many times they don't want them to grow, and there's a very different mindset behind acquiring a company. Sometimes it's to actually destroy the competition, even though they're emerging it into their own company. But that's a discussion that's happening in the business space about this particular deal. But why it didn't work, we don't know. There is this talk that they didn't want it to succeed, actually, but that's all I can say, because I was looking at it from a business perspective.
Yeah, so my question was, do we have any figure or statistic regarding the number of people who have actually subscribed to the podcast on Apple or Spotify from India or all?
That's interesting. I couldn't get to that. So some of the numbers they're keeping secret is the same with the algorithm, how they actually put you on the top charts. So they're not really giving that away. But what I will do is I'm happy to share this presentation. And if I find anything that gives away a little bit more of the subscription, I will put that in the presentation.
Okay,
but what I
thanks,
can tell you is that there is a huge investment from both Spotify and Apple that will happen in India, because they want you to use the platform. And that's why this website, I think it's called Apple Podcast for Creators, is a complete tool for you to use. And they put all their money in there because they know India is going to be such a huge market for them.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, Steffi. I'm Niranjan. I think Apple and Spotify both have rolled out their subscription plan in US in the last year, at the beginning of 2022, I guess. So, how is the response to that subscription scheme for both those platforms there? And do you have any idea? Because last month we all Marathi podcasters have attended Spotify event in Mumbai. So in that event also they predicted that we are soon rolling out subscription in India also. They are going aggressive in Indian market. So do you have any insights on when Apple and Spotify?
Apple is already active in India for subscription. So it needs a certain amount of setup. So happy to talk you through that. Idea Brew is amongst the world's top 3 subscriber networks in today.
Wow.
So for 2022. So Apple in India is active for subscribers. Spotify, as far as I know, isn't planning the subscribers separate tool. They will continue with the overall premium offering where podcasts become ad-free, or anything becomes ad-free if you're a subscriber. Yeah. I don't know if there is a separate subscriber.
So subscriber scheme for podcasters means
they're struggling to get music subscribers. So doing another for podcasters is going to be a whole other challenge.
And Steffi, another question is on video. You mentioned about videos, that it's a good idea to convert your audio, it means record video and publish that on YouTube. And on the other hand, Spotify has also entered in video to compete YouTube, I guess. So how you look at video podcasting, your view?
It's growing. And I would always ask myself the question. So when we created some of the podcasts for Sakal, we also try to understand how do I spend my money for content and how do I consume. So the first thing I would ask myself is, how much time do I spend on YouTube? And is it not sometimes nicer to watch certain podcasts on YouTube. Yes, what we see, there's a trend. They only post snippets, so not everyone is posting the entire interview. They do, but they promote just snippets of the best parts of each podcast, and usually the length is between 7 to 10 minutes, and that is a huge demand. So they really hit the millions. I'm not just talking about Joe Rogan. I'm talking about any of the big podcasts, Lex Friedman and all that. They always do the snippets, and those become viral, right? Because people not going to watch 2 hours YouTube podcasts, nor will they listen really. As you can tell, most of you must see, if you have a very long podcast, not everyone is listening till the end. They will drop out. So what I would recommend is, yes, if you have a solid following, if you have a solid, solid content, always record interviews. If it's person in person, I'm talking about person in person. If it's a virtual podcast recording, you will not have a video on that. Very, very, very few times. It's only for news podcasts who do that and are successful. But take out the most promising, the most exciting snippets of your podcast, put them in YouTube, and then promote them on all your social media accounts. And that's what we see is happening.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
All right, Steffi, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now,
Bye.
Rogan.
नमस्कार, मी गौरी कुबेर.
माझं नाव सुधीर इंगळगी.
मी अमित धर्म.
रंजन मेढेकर.
माझं नाव रोहित कोकणे.
माझं नाव शिल्पा इनामदार यज्ञोपवीत.
मी ओंकार भस्मारे.
मी सुजाता साळवी.
माझं नाव नचिकेत शिरे.
माझं नाव बिल्वा गावकर.
आजचं समिट वॉज रिअली वंडरफुल. मराठी पॉडकास्ट समिट मी पहिल्यांदा असं काही अटेंड करतोय.
इथे अनेक पॉडकास्टर्सच्या ओळखी झाल्या. ही समिट खरंच खूप इन्साइटफुल होती. कॉन्व्हर्सेशन्सच्या बाबतीत असेल किंवा स्क्रिप्टिंग कसं करायला पाहिजे,
एडिटिंग, स्क्रिप्टिंग, मार्केटिंग आणि विविध प्रकारचे पैलू त्यांनी क्लिअर केले आणि मला वाटतं ते आमच्यासारख्या पॉडकास्टर्सना खूप माहिती देणारं होतं.
सकाळ या मराठमोळ्या या कंपनीनी हा प्लॅटफॉर्म आज इथे सगळ्यांना दिला की जिथे ट्रेड सिक्रेट्स एकमेकाच्या शेअर झाल्या. सकाळनं आयोजित केलेल्या या समिटमुळं खूप छान माहिती मला मिळाली आणि पुढचा प्रवास माझा सोपा झाला.
मला वाटतं मराठी पॉडकास्टसाठी हे पहिलं अशा टाईपचं सेशन असेल.
इतकं नॉलेज शेअर झालं आणि कोर पॉडकास्टिंग काय असतं ते समजलं. सो इट वॉज व्हेरी हेल्पफुल.
आम्हा सगळ्या मराठी पॉडकास्टरसाठी हे खास संमेलन आज त्यांनी दिवसभराचं ऑर्गनाईज केलेलं, अतिशय योग्यरित्या आणि खूप नवीन इन्साईट्स, मग ते टेक्नॉलॉजीचे असू देत किंवा कंटेंटशी रिलेटेड असू देत, हे खूप छान आयडिया एक्सचेंज आज दिवसभरात झालं.
आणि ज्या पद्धतीने आजचं समिट झालं आहे सकाळ मीडियातर्फे आणि आयडिया ब्रिव्सतर्फे, सो फॅन्टॅस्टिक आयडियाज एक्सचेंज झाले आणि व्हॅल्यूज पण एक्सचेंज झाले.
आय विश देम ऑल द बेस्ट. थँक्यू सो मच सकाळ मीडिया आणि आयडिया ब्रिव्स.
थँक्स अ लॉट टू आयडिया ब्रूज अँड सकाळ ग्रुप.
थँक्यू सो मच फॉर सकाळ ऑर्गनायझिंग फॉर दिस समिट.
थँक्यू सो मच
फॉर ऑर्गनायझिंग दिस.
आणि त्यासाठी आयडिया ब्रूज आणि सकाळ डिजिटल यांचं मी आभार मानते.